Welcome to Minnesota Housing's Supportive Housing tutorial. This session provides information for applicants who will include supportive housing units in their funding application. This session will cover changes in 2018 for supportive housing, the submission requirements for applicants who plan to include supportive housing units for people who are homeless in their development, and the requirement for supportive housing units for people with disabilities. The session will also provide information on housing support, formerly known as Group Residential Housing or GRH, and coordinated entry. It will provide information about Olmstead principles and considerations for supportive housing settings. Finally, you will also learn about a unique resource, the National Housing Trust Fund. There are a few major changes this year for supportive housing applications. For permanent supportive housing units for households experiencing homelessness, the tenant eligibility criteria has changed from long-term homeless to high-priority homeless, or HPH. This simply means that high-priority homeless are households that are prioritized for supportive housing by the local coordinated entry system. The tenant referral process and eligibility documentation should be much easier with this change. The bonus points for homeless units have been eliminated, but the points for the number of homeless units have increased. And the points for the number of units for people with disabilities have also increased. Also, there are no longer specific points for rental assistance for the supportive housing units, but the number of points in the rental assistance section has expanded, and there are additional points for rental assistance that also has an income restriction of 30% of MTSP. MTSP stands for Multifamily Tax Subsidy Projects. Here's a quick review of the basic requirements for applications with supportive housing units. These documents must be completed in their entirety and submitted with your application to be eligible for high-priority homeless points. For the supportive housing narrative, please make sure to thoroughly answer all of the questions to give us a good picture of your supportive housing plan. The owner, the property manager, and the service provider need to work together to complete the narrative. And also note that the development must have a designated service provider at the time of the application to be considered feasible. The service provider must sign the narrative. The Continuum of Care, or COC confirmation form, is a form that must be signed by the COC to confirm that the proposed units meet a need in the service area. The COCs expect all applicants to provide information about the development to the COC committee before they will complete the form. Most COCs meet monthly, so applicants need to contact the COC coordinator as soon as possible to make arrangements. Contact information is provided on the COC form. Note that the COC form is not required in Hennepin County. The Human Services Confirmation Letter must also be submitted by the application due date, so please contact your county or tribal Human Services office as soon as possible so they have time to review your proposal and complete the letter. The last document is the Service Provider Qualification Form. This form can be submitted by the service provider anytime before the Request for Proposals or RFP due date. There are also a few things that need to be correctly filled out in the workbook. On the Project Description tab in the Demographics table, be sure to enter the number of permanent supportive housing units for the development. This includes all homeless and people with disabilities units. And on the Housing Income tab, be sure to indicate which units will be used for supportive housing. Click the High Priority Homeless or HPH box, and also make sure to indicate if they have rental assistance and the source of that rental assistance. To qualify for the high priority homeless points, all applications must meet the threshold criteria, which includes: for support services, the level and type of services offered should be appropriate for the needs of the population to be served, with a minimum of tenant service coordination of an average of 2 hours per household per week. For an experienced service provider with demonstrated outcomes, at a minimum, the service provider has experience providing services to a similar population to maintain housing over a period of time, and the service provider has sufficient capacity to deliver the services proposed. For service funding commitments, at a minimum, a portion of service funding is secured, and there is a viable plan for securing the remaining resources. The applicant must provide evidence in the application narrative and commitment letters or other documentation. And finally, for coordinated entry, the property owner must agree to accept, through coordinated entry, high-priority homeless households for the units. Evidence for meeting the threshold criteria must be provided in the supportive housing narrative, service provider qualification form, and funding commitment documents. Many properties use housing support to pay tenant rents. Housing support is a state-funded income supplement that pays for housing costs for extremely low-income adults with a disabling condition. The County Human Services Office administers the program and enters into contracts with providers, which is generally the supportive housing service provider, but in some cases it could be the property owner or management agent. Many counties, including Hennepin County, do an annual RFP to select new housing support properties and providers, so it is important to contact the county early in your development planning process. The housing support benefit amount is $904. Refer to our underwriting standards, which can be found on our website at www.mnhousing.gov for information about how to set the rents for the housing support units. There is also a supplemental service rate available for service providers, but the tenants must be long-term homeless. For the RFP, applicants must submit evidence of an agreement with the county or enter into a housing support contract. If you'd like to learn more about housing support, the Minnesota Department of Human Services, also known as DHS, will provide a training session at Minnesota Housing on May 2nd at 9 a.m. Applicants may also contact DHS or county staff for technical assistance. I will now address coordinated entry and how it works for supportive housing. Coordinated entry is a HUD requirement for continuums of care, or COCs, and state agencies also require participation by all housing and service providers. Each local COC has its own policies and processes for coordinated entry, but basic aspects are as follows. Any person seeking homeless assistance can go to a central access point to apply for assistance. They won't have to go from office to find someone to help them. The household will be assessed to determine the type of housing service they need. If the service is available, the household will be referred to the appropriate housing or service provider. If the appropriate service is not available at the time, the household will be placed on a waiting list. The households that are placed on the waiting list are prioritized by highest need. For supportive housing providers, when you have a unit available, you must notify the coordinated entry contact person. They will refer households to you from the top of the waiting list that appear to meet the eligibility criteria for the unit. The referred households will then go through your standard application process. And please note that all Minnesota Housing Finance developments that have high priority homeless units must use coordinated entry for all referrals for open units. We also want to call your attention to the opportunity to create units for people with disabilities. The points for creating these units are available under the greatest need, tenant, and affordability targeting selection priority. As mentioned earlier, the points for the number of units have increased this year. Just remember that these units cannot be the same units as the supportive housing units for high priority homeless households. And there is a key difference between high priority homeless and people with disabilities in regard to who is responsible for providing support services. While the developer is responsible for providing services for high-priority homeless units, the County or Tribal Human Services Office will be responsible for providing services for people with disabilities through mainstream resources such as Medicaid-funded services. In addition, the County or Tribe will determine the populations to be served and the referral process for these units. Developers should consult with their local Human Services Office to learn about the housing needs for people with disabilities. Most counties are working to transition people from care facilities back into the community. Applicants will need to have a service agreement with the County or Tribal Human Services Office or a designated service provider. Refer to the scoring criteria for specific information that must be included in the agreement. The application narrative for people with disabilities must be completed and can also serve as a service agreement if it is signed by the service entity. Applications must also meet the threshold criteria outlined on the self-scoring worksheet to be eligible for the points. And finally, I want to point out that the income restriction for these units is 30% of MTSP, so it is important to have a rental subsidy for tenants. If a subsidy is not available for these units, the rent levels can be underwritten at the supportive housing underwriting standard. For applicants that are proposing a number of units for people with disabilities, including homeless units serving adults with disabilities, consider the principles of the state's Olmstead plan in your development. The plan is a broad series of key activities Minnesota must accomplish to ensure people with disabilities are living, learning, working, and enjoying life in the most integrated setting. The key elements are choice and independence so that people with disabilities have the opportunity to live independently, to live close to their family and friends, to engage in productive employment, and to participate in community life. People should have as much choice and independence as possible. They should have a lease and control of their own unit. They should have the freedom to come and go as they please, have visitors, make their own choices for daily activities, and have opportunities to participate fully in community life. And, to the extent possible, people with similar disabilities should not be grouped together at the property, and they should be able to choose their own services and service provider. Also, applicants planning to use home and community-based services, or HCBS, in their development must be aware of the new federal rule for HCBS setting guidelines. The Minnesota Department of Human Services, also known as DHS, evaluates all settings using HCBS to ensure compliance with the rule. If the property triggers a potential isolating characteristic, such as having more than 25% of units serve people with disabilities and providing multiple services on site, the service provider will need to provide evidence to DHS that the setting meets the HCBS guidelines, which are essentially the principles outlined in the Olmstead plan. For more information about the HCBS rule, refer to the Supportive Housing Information and Resources publication that can be found on Minnesota Housing's website at www.mnhousing.gov. We anticipate having funding again this year from the National Housing Trust Fund. Since the funds are limited to serve people with extremely low incomes, Minnesota Housing decided that supportive housing would have a priority for these funds. The funds can be used for capital costs for new construction or the reuse of an unoccupied building. The state can also allocate up to 30% of the total funding to help pay the operating costs for assisted units for up to 15 years. If you plan to apply for the National Housing Trust Fund operating subsidy, there are some specific application materials and tools for you to review and/or complete, including a short narrative and a calculation tool for determining the operating subsidy amount needed. Also, remember to look for the instructions for completing certain sections of the workbook to show the operating subsidy information. Finally, we want to thank you for all you do to provide supportive housing to people experiencing homelessness and people with disabilities in Minnesota. For more information about supportive housing, please contact Vicki Farden or Joel Salzer, or visit our website. Select the Multifamily Partners section on the right side of the page. Under the Apply for Funding tab, select Supportive Housing. Again, thank you for taking the time to view this tutorial.